So good morning, everyone. Thank you for including our paper in the program. Short story, we started working on CRA papers. We already have 2 papers about this after coming to this conference 5 years ago and hearing community bankers talking about how important the CRA is. So this is a joint work with Erica, Carlos, and Yuan. And today I will talk about the unintended consequences of the Community Reinvestment Act on banks' branching and lending decisions amid the rise of non-banks. So access to credit plays an important role for economic growth and employment, but it usually comes unequally distributed. So to overcome this issue, countries have implemented different interventions to promote equal access to credit by regulating banks to supply credit to underserved neighborhoods. So one prominent example of this type of regulation here in the US is the Community Reinvestment Act, also known as the CRA. The CRA was enacted in 1977 with the goal of reducing redlining and also to reduce geographical inequality. So the act mandates banks to extend credit, particularly mortgages and small business lending, to low and moderate, to all the communities in which they operate or they have branches, particularly low and moderate income census tracts. However, the financial landscape has changed a lot in the last decade, particularly with the rise of non-banks. So what we aim to study in this paper are the economic consequences of this location-based regulation in the non-bank area. So using a parsimonious model, we provide empirical evidence and a quantification exercise that the CRA widens disparities in credit access across regions. So particularly, we show that banks subsidize underserved neighborhoods within rich assessment areas. However, in poor assessment areas in which compliance cost is higher, banks reduce their branches or close their branches, and that affects small business lending in the entire area. So as non-banks expand in the mortgage market, we observe that the number of areas affected by this CRA-induced branch closure increases. So overall, what we document in this paper is that the CRA widens cross-region disparities in different economic outcomes as non-banks expand their market share in the residential mortgage market. So let me briefly talk about the CRA. So the act mandates banks to provide sufficient lending in CRA-eligible census tracts within the banking assessment area. So the assessment area depends on or is defined as MSAs or counties in which banks have branches or deposit-taking ATMs. A CRA-eligible census tract or an LMI census tract are those census tracts with median family income below the 80% of the median family income of the entire assessment area. And banks that fail the CRA cannot engage in any mergers and acquisitions. They cannot open new branches, and they face a lot of public pressure. So we use a model to first understand the trade-off that banks face, and also to support our empirical approach. So in our model, we have a region that has 2 subregions, an LMI and a non-LMI subregion. So banks choose how much to lend to subregion 1, how much to lend to subregion 2, and whether to have a branch or not in order to maximize their profits. And their profits are coming from the lending profit, but if the bank chooses to have a branch, they are going to face a regulatory cost. And this regulatory cost is mainly driven by this delta, which I'm going to call the cost of the CRA, and the lending gap, which is the difference between what they are required to lend to the underserved region relative to what they would have lent in the absence of the CRA. So banks face a downward slope in lending demand curve for each subregion that depends on the demand for bank lending, which is alpha and alpha I, beta, which is the demand elasticity. A smaller beta means that that region has stronger economic fundamentals, and a branch preference gamma. So in terms of banks branching decisions, banks are going to have a branch if the difference in profit between having or not having a branch is positive. That means that the benefit of having a branch is higher than the regulatory cost. However, in those assessment areas in which the regulatory cost is higher, that means that delta pi is negative, banks are not going to have branches there. So just to give you some illustration about the net effect, here this figure shows the relationship between lending and the economic fundamentals of the assessment areas. So in rich assessment areas or more developed assessment areas, the benefits of having a branch is higher than the cost of having a branch. So banks are going to have a branch in rich assessment areas, and as a consequence, LMI neighborhoods or any LMI census tracts are going to receive more lending with the CRA than without the CRA. So there is a cross-subsidization in rich assessment areas. On the other hand, in less economically developed assessment areas, banks are going to close their branches or they are not going to have branches. And as a consequence, with the CRA, both LMIs and non-LMI census tracts are going to receive less lending. So now let me move to the empirical analysis. The big empirical question now is whether the CRA compliance lead to branch closure. So here we are going to model the regulatory burden as the difference between these differing profits in a world without the CRA and with CRA. And this is determined by the cost of the CRA, which is delta for each bank, and the lending gap, right? Any negative shock to alpha, to the demand for bank loans, is going to increase the lending gap, and as a consequence, is going to increase the regulatory burden. So what we are going to do in the empirical analysis is to compare branching and lending decisions of banks with different delta when they face a negative alpha shock or a negative a reduction in bank loans. So for that, we need two things. We need first to estimate delta for each bank, the cost of the CRA for each bank, and we need a negative shock. So to measure the cost, the CRA cost for each bank, we are going to rely on a regression discontinuity design around the eligibility threshold. So the main intuition is that around the threshold, those census tracts are similar in terms of demand and economic fundamentals, but the only thing that is going to change is the eligibility for the CRA. So what we are going to do is to compare the lending between those census tracts just below the threshold, which are eligible for the CRA, relative to the lending for those census tracts just above the threshold in a regression discontinuity design framework. And with that, we are going to estimate the delta B, the cost of the CRA, for each bank. So what we find is that overall, indeed, census tracts just below the threshold, that means those CRA eligible census tracts receive 2% more of mortgage lending than those just above the threshold. So with this delta B for each bank, what we are going to do is to create an indicator variable equal to 1 if the delta of that bank is above the median. And we are going to call that indicator a bank having a high delta or high cost of CRA. So now that we have delta, we need a negative shock to alpha. And what we are going to use for this negative shock is the rise of non-banks or shadow banks in the real estate, in the residential mortgage market. That rise of shadow banks is going to decrease, the bank credit demand. And to overcome any endogeneity concern, we are going to use a Bartik approach in which we are going to use the market share of non-banks before the rise of shadow banks between 2005 to 2008, and we are going to interact that with the national non-bank growth. So let me jump in and show you the first set of results. So in terms of branching decisions, we find that overall banks with high CRA costs are going to be more likely to close branches as non-banks or shadow banks expand. Particularly, we observe that a 30% increase, which is close to a 1 standard deviation increase in the non-bank market share, is going to lead to 3.9% higher likelihood to a complete branch withdrawal. We also observe that the same increase in market share is going to lead to less number of branches. So in terms of lending, we also observe a negative effect on lending, not only for mortgages, but also for small business loans. So we see that a 30% increase in non-bank market share is going to lead to a decrease in 14.5% of mortgage lending for banks with high CRA costs relative to banks with low CRA costs. And importantly, we also see a decrease in 13% in small business lending, which is the type of lending that relies a lot on branches. So if we aggregate these bank level results to local results or market level results, what we observe is that at the market level, there is not effect in terms of mortgages because other players like other banks or fintech lenders or non-banks are jumping in and filling the gap. But in terms of small business lending, we indeed see a drop in small business lending at the market level, which suggests that market adjustments fail to fill this gap. So as the model predicts, the effects are concentrated. This decrease in branches and also in lending is concentrated in neighborhoods, in assessment areas with low income and higher share of minority groups. So economically disadvantaged assessment areas are the marginal areas, shifting from benefiting with the CRA to suffering from the CRA as non-banks expand in the residential mortgage market. So now let me briefly talk about the net effect. Should we be concerned about the adverse effects of the CRA? So what we are going to do now is put in our model and empirical estimates together, and we are going to estimate each area in this graph. The main takeaways of this quantification exercise is that indeed we see a reduction in 3.4% in overall lending, not only residential lending, but also small lending with the CRA. And if we do the quantification exercise with expansion of non-banks, what we observe is that 43% of the counties shift from benefiting from the CRA, having this crop subsidization, to suffering from the CRA as non-banks expand in the mortgage market. So in my last minute, I'm going to briefly talk about the market level results. So assessment areas with or less economically developed assessment areas are the more binding in terms of CRA compliance, and what we observe is that these type of assessment areas, as the non-banks expand, experience a increase in the population of living in bank deserts. That means zip codes without any branches. We also see an increase in the share of unbanked households, especially low-income households. We see this decline in a small business at the market level for these type of assessment areas. And interestingly, but sad at the same time, we see a reduction in the number of small business establishments. So let me conclude here. There are two ways in which we can promote equal access to credit. One is by giving transfer. Another way is by regulating banks. But we need to take into account the supply side adjustments when we are evaluating this type of regulations. Overall, what we find is that the CRA improves credit equality in rich assessment areas at the cost of the poor assessment areas or less economically developed assessment areas, causing banks withdraw. And as shadow banks or non-banks expand, that reduces the set of assessment areas that benefit from the CRA. Thank you so much for your time. I'm looking forward to answer comments.